our digital economy has skyrocketed in both popularity and necessity as Canadians from every corner of the country look to stay connected, relevant, and economically viable. Ryan McLaughlin is a senior economist and research analyst at the Information Communications Technology Council. He joined me this week to discuss how our digital economy trends have shifted as we all adjust to these unprecedented times. I'm Kevin McShann. Let's have this conversation. If you're ready, Ryan, we're going to get started, and I want to welcome you to the show, and we're excited to talk a little bit about the digital economy with you this morning.
Thank you. I'm glad to join.
So, in April, CTV News reported that 5 million Canadians are now working from home. So, I'll just start you off by asking you, how do you think that trend will affect the digital economy? Because in the same article, it said that many of those polled for the story said it would be a permanent trend. So, I'm just wondering, how do you think that development will affect the digital economy moving forward?
Yeah, well, first I'll just say the COVID-19 crisis has had the biggest impact on the Canadian economy since the end of the Second World War, probably. So, since February, we've seen GDP drop by about a fifth. About 3 million Canadians have lost regular employment. These are all slightly lagging indicators, so, we'll receive updated data soon. But that's about 15% of jobs were lost, regular jobs. The Canadian Emergency Response Benefit has said that nearly 9 million Canadians are receiving the benefit, and the debt is expected to rise from 700 billion prior to the crisis. The PBO estimates that it could reach $1 trillion by the end of the year. So that would send our federal debt to GDP ratio from 31% before the crisis to 48% afterwards. So, this is a huge shock. So naturally, it's causing a rethink in a lot of the various, in many different aspects of society. And that includes the digital economy and many technology firms. So, doing some of our research at ICTC, one of the things that has struck me is this shift that a lot of the leading technology firms in Silicon Valley and in Canada have taken in the way that they're producing the services that they produce. So for example, Apple and the technology firms traditionally kind of led the way in terms of these open plan, big office spaces where the employees are all expected to come together and interact and come up with new ideas. So one thing I read was, Steve Jobs, when he was at Pixar, he wanted to design the office, and this was in the 80s, I believe, to have a centralized one set of bathrooms. And this ultimately didn't happen. It was unpopular for obvious reasons. But the idea was that everyone would be forced to come together and have these interactions when they go to the bathroom. They would actually have to go downstairs to inconvenience themselves to meet. So now what we've seen is a total 180 from all the major technology firms. So I think Twitter and Square, both led by Jack Dorsey, have said that basically they're going to make their staff permanent. Google has permanently remote, that is. Google has said that it won't be before the end of the year. Most of the major technology firms have said the rest of 2020, everyone's going remote. And then with Facebook, they basically have announced these plans to just permanently switch to a huge portion of their staff just working remotely. So I think their plan is within 10 years to have half of their technical staff working remotely. They plan on basically adjusting people's wages by the cost of living of the jurisdiction they're in. So this is a huge change, and in Canada, Spotify. So Spotify had these plans to fill out this new giant office space in Vancouver, but now there's these questions if they're going to actually do that, if the what's going to happen there, because basically, from what I've read, their CEO has said we're going to switch to like a total 180 on how we're doing things. We're not going to have remote workers which kind of orbit the physical office space. In reverse, we're going to have sort of remote being the core with some occasional avenues for people to meet up. So it's, to me, it's quite fascinating how kind of the core, you could argue the core elements of the digital economy, that is these sort of prestigious technology firms, have chosen to really do a 180 on the way that they're conceptualizing the production of the services that they create. So, a few of the other kind of speculative observations that you could make is, I think we're going to see perhaps a consolidation of power among these technology firms. So, obviously this pandemic has caused a great amount of financial strain. Perhaps a lot of these small businesses are going bankrupt, or may soon go bankrupt. Whereas on the other hand, you have companies like Amazon doing better than ever. There's been this speculation about why the stock market at this point has barely, I don't think it's down from the beginning of 2020. So there's been essentially no loss in value in the US stock market, at least, say the S&P 500 index, since January. And a big part of this reason, I think, is that tech stocks, the so-called FANG stocks, make up such a big proportion of the index. And these stocks are not too damaged by by COVID. Obviously Netflix is fine, Amazon seems to be fine, Google is fine. They're all able to produce remotely, and their services have greater demand in the midst of this pandemic.
And can you tell me, let's talk about optimization for a second. Can you tell me, what ways do you think people are using the digital economy more to optimize their earning potential, and what ways do you think they're underutilizing it for that purpose?
So I think some of the means that people have been using to optimize their earning potential could include, so the things that have been done could include these code boot camps and online learning. So that's one of the things that we're really interested in at ICTC. Our office, actually, before it was shut down, and we've in Vancouver, we abandoned the lease. Now we're just remote, but we were in with Lighthouse Labs, which is a code boot camp. So I think these sorts of things have become increasingly important, especially because a lot of the digital economy is quite meritocratic. When we do these interviews, I've been doing interviews with the VFX industry, so film, television, animation. When you ask them what's the minimum level of education required for your junior roles, they typically kind of say, I don't really know. It's not that important. It just depends what your portfolio is. What can you do? How can you, what are your programming skills? So that's one thing that has been taking place and has implications for higher ed. Another thing is the gig economy, which of course many people have written about, including us at ICTC. And this is as much a game theoretic innovation as it is a technology innovation. So the problem with, so when we think about Uber or Airbnb, the problem with traditional taxis compared to Uber, for example, is that it's a one-off transaction. So both players in the game, if you call it, have somewhat perverse incentives to not necessarily behave in the best way. Whereas Uber turns this into a repeated game. So it really changes the the nature of these interactions. And this gig economy, I think that's one of the fundamental characteristics of it. And that's why people talk about Uber for X. You know, this new app is going to be the Uber for this, because they're taking this underlying core innovation and extending it to different things. So, you know, sort of like Airbnb is Uber for housing. So that's an interesting and important development. And I'd say the third would be proliferation of exchange traded funds in finance, ETFs, with robo advisors, so-called robo advisors like Wealthsimple or Modern Advisor, which are both Canadian firms, which essentially put your money into ETFs and guide it for you. So the important thing about this is it democratizes access to the stock market, which is the best, one of the, you know, it's the best way for millennials, at least, I think, to receive interest. You know, it's easy to keep your money in a checking account and receive, you know, less than 0.5% interest rate. But with these new robo-advisors, we're seeing this surge of cash into ETFs and into these indices, which allows everyday investors, you know, like me and like you, to benefit from interest from the stock market.
And in terms of what you would like to see people do to use other aspects of the digital economy that they're not necessarily using now, what would you say to that?
So one thing that has been in my mind recently, especially since I just being able to work remotely now, I've gone to Quebec, is this notion of remote work. And speaking about all these tech firms allowing their employees now to work remote, I think what we might see going forward is a really fundamental shift in the location of work. You know, and obviously Canada has this huge issue with housing affordability, but that issue is particularly focused in the big cities, where in some ways, if you want a certain kind of job, suppose if you want to work on Bay Street, you have to live in Toronto. So what would be interesting is if what we see going forward is a shift where, again, there's this democratization that takes place, and people that live in Windsor, Ontario, or live on Vancouver Island, or live in Prince Edward Island can work in these high-paying industries that previously were exclusive to those living in the big, expensive cities. So this would really do a lot, I think, to reshape people's access to careers, as well as, frankly, people's disposable income. So that's a really exciting possibility. You know, it even has implications for international migration. Where do people, you know, live in other countries even? So that kind of connects to this idea of the offshoring of white collar work or telemedicine. So again, we're kind of, with this pandemic, we've seen telemedicine have some of the regulations loosened on it, such that it's allowed more and more. Whereas before there were restrictions, it's difficult to allow it in certain provinces. So this could really change the way healthcare is provided, and it could even end up resulting in healthcare becoming something that's negotiated in free trade agreements, for example. So perhaps countries in the future are going to have to think about under what rules should you be allowed to speak to a American doctor on Zoom and receive healthcare from that person. You know, that this could get very complicated very fast. But with Zoom and these video apps as we're using now, improving with and especially with augmented and virtual reality, if this technology really does become quite good and easy and user-friendly, you could imagine all kinds of white-collar work or service sector work, which was previously immune to globalization, becoming an issue in these free trade agreements and
the Information Technology Communications Council is also leading the way when it comes to assisting employers in gaining access to skilled and younger workers to help diversify their workforces through their digital equity employability pathways, which allows employers to gain access to skilled workers who want to pursue a career in the tech or digital economy sector. McLaughlin explains how it works and how it can provide all businesses with a competitive advantage.
Sure. So ICTC's got a number of capacity building programs, basically to help employers and tech employees match up and to provide various subsidies and things like that. So that DEEP program, which you mentioned, Digital Equity and Employability Pathways, it works with newcomers, refugees, and indigenous communities to connect with employers. To connect employers with newly trained and upskilled individuals looking to grow their careers in ICT. So participants in the program go through a series of courses, based on communication, leadership, social media presence, and networking from ICTC, and we partnered with Microsoft. So the Microsoft Career Pathways program provide training concentrations in cybersecurity, AI, and data science. So we've got other programs like that as well. Will Digital offers employers financial incentives to hire post-secondary students. So we've got various subsidy programs like that.
Can you also tell me how big you think the digital economy will be in providing individuals with disabilities employment as well in the future?
I absolutely think that that's an important area. So that's something ICTC is interested in. And we do have programs to help employers connect with underrepresented groups in the tech sector like that. So particularly if we think about how remote work and technology could facilitate potentially people with disabilities working in these industries more easily, I think there's a undertapped resource there. There's all kinds of technologies which are emerging, which could make it easier for people with, for instance, impaired mobility to more easily work in these sectors.
With nearly half the year now in the books, I asked McLaughlin to shed some light on how our digital economy has shifted and what we can expect moving forward.
So one thing that's, I think, worth thinking about is that this is a very particular kind of crisis, the COVID-19 crisis. If the crisis had taken a different form, we would be having radically different results. So, I was just learning about a big solar flare, which occurred, I can't remember the exact date, but it was in the early 20th century, I believe. And basically, the solar flare exploded the sort of archaic electrical infrastructure they had at the time, and people that were working with, I think it was telegrams, got electrical shocks. So imagine that a big solar flare like that had happened, and it destroyed our electrical infrastructure. It put the internet down. I mean, obviously, we would be having a very different reaction to that. Or if there had been some kind of geopolitical turmoil, suppose that would have scrambled supply chains all the same, but maybe we wouldn't be seeing the same thing about small businesses suffering so much. So I think that it's a very particular kind of crisis that has taken place, and the implications of it are particular. But in this case, what's happened is it really does seem to have consolidated the digital economy. Obviously, everything's gone remote. Companies are more interested in accelerating their so-called digital transformation processes even more than they were before. And the technology firms have either not been harmed or have even benefited, whereas their competitors in the non-technology world, the physical, firms, you could call them, have really been undercut. So, we've seen some aspects of globalization accelerated, but many have gone in reverse. Some of the things that were already being questioned have suddenly become even more apparent. So, there have been questions floating around about globalization and free trade and national security. Where do we draw the lines? Suddenly, an issue that wasn't on our minds before this crisis, the production of PPE and medical equipment, personal protective equipment, the jurisdiction where that takes place has leaped to the forefront. And now we're all thinking about, should we support domestic industries or not for these kinds of things? So I guess in short, the crisis has consolidated the digital economy for sure. And it's caused the emergence of certain new digital economy phenomena, like there's all kinds of prefab apps which have emerged, which basically, suppose you very quickly have to shut down your physical operations, but you still need to, and before you were just keeping track of inventory on a piece of paper and staff on literally, you had your staff timesheet. There's new applications which emerge, which don't have to be customized for the company, but can just be downloaded and very easily customized yourself. So these kinds of things are emerging to kind of rapidly address the challenges. And I think, so putting those digital economy that aspect to the side, there's all these social changes which are obviously taking place now. And I've said this already, but I really think the remote work phenomena could really radically change the way cities look, the way societies look, the way people's disposable income looks. And this is a digital economy phenomena as well.
And can you just tell me how your organization, the ICTC, is looking forward to contributing to the digital economy discussion in the future?
Sure. So as we said before, there's kind of two arms to the organization. There's the capacity building arm, which does the DEEP program and all these training programs and all these subsidy programs. So that's kind of on the labor market side. And then I work in the research and policy side, which we basically write reports and do research, which guides the other side to the organization, but is also, typically the people that hire us to write these reports are the government. Sometimes it's other nonprofits. Sometimes it's the private sector. We've worked with Microsoft. And basically we write reports on all various kinds of aspects of the digital economy. I've contributed to reports on blockchain, AI, 5G, written forecasts. So right now we're working on updating last year's economic forecasts for the general economy and for the digital economy. And it's a kind of a terrifying business to be in, trying to come up with a forecast for what's going to happen, because who knows. But we'll see what we can estimate. And we've also just released a report called Economic Resiliency in the Face of Adversity, which is going to sort of outlines our proposed steps that Canada could take to emerge from this crisis in decent shape.
And my final question for you has to do with how do you think we can use the digital economy moving forward to live a more efficient life and live a more efficient work life as well?
Sure. So I think obviously this crisis, as I've said, has underlined the value of this parallel universe we have in the online world. So much of our, we've even, notwithstanding all this economic carnage, which we mentioned at the top of the podcast, we've been able to become a socially distanced society fairly effectively, thanks to this digital economy that we've built. So I think that's worth observing, and it's interesting. If we didn't have this internet infrastructure that we've built over the past several decades, we wouldn't even have been able to try social distancing, sort of. We wouldn't have even been able to do quarantines. So, you can say maybe we didn't do them effectively enough, maybe we weren't strict, or maybe we were too strict. But, this infrastructure we've built and this parallel universe we have has enabled us to try with these quarantines, at least. So that's interesting. In general, in terms of efficiency, I've mentioned this, but I think one of the most important recent developments in the digital economy, specifically within the gig economy, are these platform apps which solve matching problems. And I think this is a core efficiency improving aspect to this new technology. So whether it's Uber or TaskRabbit, that connect someone who needs something and someone who has something that other person needs. And this is obviously, if you're able to connect these people that weren't able to be connected before, this unleashes a lot of efficiency, economic efficiency, but also just well-being. So if it's Tinder, if it's dating apps, if there's two people that would be compatible together, and in the counterfactual, without Tinder they never would have met, and now they do, that's a huge gain. Or meetup.com. There's so many, for instance, blockchain community meetups on there, coding meetups, and then just hikes and stuff like that. All this wouldn't have happened without the digital economy, and this is clearly unlocking a lot of human potential, which before was just missed, was wasted. So in a way, it's kind of like that Steve Jobs thing where they wanted to have one bathroom and everyone comes to the one bathroom and meets and interacts. The internet is it's facilitating a lot of these interactions, which is unleashing creativity which didn't exist before. Of course, we all know this, but it's worth remembering if we ever feel that, for instance, there's been not fast enough economic growth. There are these serious improvements that have taken place. And then there's blockchain, which is sort of on the horizon still. Of course, we've gone through this kind of up and down with Bitcoin, and perhaps some people are disillusioned with it. And I'm not the person to say for sure or not whether or not blockchain is going to change the nature of the internet. But some people believe it could shift us from the internet we have now, which is about copying and proliferating information, to some people call it the internet of value. So the classic example could be the music industry, where information can just be freely copied and proliferated. It breaks down certain industries, and the music industry has struggled until now with business models like Spotify to know how to monetize, and it really damaged the industry. So the solution has turned out to be streaming apps like Spotify. But another solution could have potentially been blockchain. If you can get the internet of value, you can really say, I'm going to sell you this song, and you can't just copy it and proliferate it. And I guess the final thing to highlight would be entrepreneurship is easier than ever. So the ability to create a new business, depending on what it is, of course, but it's cheaper than ever to get a domain name, to learn a skill using these edX or these online code academies, or even a code boot camp. To gain the skill is cheaper than ever. To set up your website is cheaper than ever. To market, to go on LinkedIn, start cold calling or cold texting people, or to buy ads. Your upfront costs for starting certain kinds of businesses are lower than ever before. So I think that should be a serious source of optimism going forward.
Hey, Ryan, we want to thank you for providing your insights and perspectives on the future and current state of the digital economy. It was a lot of fun. I want to thank you for your time and have a great weekend,
Thank you so
okay?
much, Kevin. It was a pleasure to speak with you.